Hello and welcome back to Noble Green Wines, and today we're going to be looking at some fortified wines. We're going to be looking at a sherry, a Madeira and a port. Now, starting off with the sherry, there's the sherry triangle, which includes Jerez, the main town, San Lucar de Barrameda on the coast, and Puerto de Santa Maria. The main area of production is Jerez itself, closely followed by San Lucar, which is where this one is from, the Manzanilla. The main grape here is the Palomino Fino, which is quite a bland grape. It makes quite an interesting wine on its own, but it's all about the aging process in sherry. There's another one called Pedro Jimenez. Now, most people don't realise sherry is naturally dry when it's made, whichever style it is, and it's made medium or sweet by the addition of the Pedro Jimenez, which is a grape that naturally raisins quite easily, so you get this lovely sticky juice out of it. Gorgeous on its own, lovely with ice cream. But it's added to the other sherries to make cream or medium styles. So looking at this one here, now the Palomino is grown throughout the region. The best soils are the Alberitza soils, which is a very chalky soil. It's grown in other areas, the Bodegas, which are quite sandy soils, but the best ones are grown on the Alberitza soil. Now the wine is vinified in the normal way, as we've discussed before, so it's vinified dry, gets to about 11%, not particularly strong, but what happens next is what makes the sherry. It's then fortified by the addition of neutral grape spirit, in the cases of finos or manzanillas to about 15%, in the case of wines destined to become olorosos, much higher to about 19, even 20%. Now what that does is, in the case of the olorosos, which we're not particularly discussing today, it means that the wines age oxidatively in the barrel. The barrels are filled and there's a little gap of air left at the top. And what happens is the wine gradually ages in an oxidative manner, so it takes on all those amber overtones and colour and that lovely caramel nuttiness that you get from an Oloroso. Now what happens in the case of Fino and Manzanilla is quite different. The barrels are filled the same amount with the wine that's at 15%, there or thereabouts. The gap is left, but what happens here is there's a naturally occurring yeast which produces a floor, which is a film of yeast on top of the wine. And what happens next is that the wine ages, but it ages without any oxidation at all, an anaerobic aging. And as the wine matures, it takes on different flavours, a sort of salty tang, it retains a lovely freshness. And the next thing they do, more to maintain this consistency of style with the wine, is that they draw a little bit from one barrel into the next and then add the fresh wine in at the top. Now these barrels are stacked in rows called criaderas, and as the wine is drawn into the next one down, there's more mature wine in that's drawn into the next one below that, and so on. And the bottom row is called the Solera, and this is called the Solera system. It's basically a fractional blending system, so you're constantly blending new wine into old. So you get, with a wine like this, a Fino or Manzanilla, an average age of about 3 years of maturation in this manner. And then the wine, when it's ready to bottle, is drawn out of the bottom row, the Solera, and bottled. So if we give this a little taste now, it looks like an unfortified wine. It's quite pale lemon in colour, and it's got a lovely freshness. Now Manzanilla actually means chamomile, and you can detect that on this because the Manzanilla is produced nearer the coast, Jerez is further into town, so as the wine's maturing, it's slightly cooler than San Lucar. So the difference between Finos and Manzanillas are a little more delicate, a little more floral in style. Gorgeous freshness and that lovely bready, yeasty note from the aging underfloor. Again, the chamomile coming through on the finish. Really gorgeous wine. This is perfect with the little local shrimp fritters that they do in the square there. Have it well chilled. This, for me, is one of the best value wines in the world. If you think of the amount of work that's gone into this over the years, all the blending and everything before it gets into the bottle, it's fantastic value. Next, we come to Madeira, and this is a small Portuguese island off the northwest coast of Africa. Quite a temperate climate all year round, generally quite warm, but not as hot as its location would make you think. Now Madeira, originally the wines that were exported from the island were in barrel and they were lashed to the decks of ships, and they were fortified, literally fortified against the journey to strengthen and bolster the wine, to stop it from spoiling too much on the journey. And what they found was the constant heat and cold and gradual oxidation from being in barrel actually improved the wine. They weren't expecting this, and when for the first time a barrel came back, they found that it was very much to their taste. It wasn't at all what they'd expected. You would expect heat and oxidation to ruin a wine, whereas in fact, in this case, it's improved it massively. Now, the main way that Madeira is produced these days is by mimicking this sort of heating and cooling process that goes on, and the gradual oxidation. It's called the estufagem process, which is quite often done by heating the tanks and cooling them with the use of steam or pipes. In the best lodges, for the very best wines, they use the canero process, which is basically mimicking the same thing that happened on the ships by putting the barrels in the roofs of the bodegas and allowing them to sort of heat up and cool down in a more natural way. This takes much longer than simply using heat from a direct source to do the process, but it's worth it for the longevity of the wines. As I said, the process of making the Madeira is essentially spoiling it. So once it's made, it's actually it's almost indestructible. It's very hard to ruin it. You can open a bottle of Madeira and keep it for month upon month upon month, and it won't really change any. Now, the main grapes that are grown on the island for the production, there's one, the Tinta Negra Mole, which is used in the production of, to put it bluntly, cooking Madeira. Can be very nice, perfectly palatable, but it's best used in cooking. The other grapes are Malvasia, Ual, Cercial and Verdelho, which go from the sort of sweeter end of the spectrum down to the drier, just because of the natural properties of the grapes. This here is a blend of some of the sweeter ones, the Ual and the Malvasia. Doesn't say to what proportion, but they will just blend whatever they think is best to create their house style from the tanks that they have available. This is roughly an average age of 3 years old, quite young for a Madeira. Some of the better ones, 15 years old, and you can get sort of vintage dated Colita Madeiras, which are much more expensive. This is just an introduction, so I wanted to try you on one of the basic entry-level Madeiras. Now, this is a medium sweet Madeira, and you can already see from the colour that it's definitely had oxidative aging. It's got a lovely caramel, nutty brown colour. On the nose, the first thing that hits me is coffee. Lovely coffee and chocolate combination. Lots of dried fruit, figs, Christmas pudding, but still a little bit of freshness on the finish as well. This is not a cloying wine. In common with some styles of fortified wine, the fortification occurs during the fermentation, so it arrests the fermentation, which leaves a desired level of sweetness, unlike the sherry where it's fermented dry and then aged. So the level of sweetness in this is not added sweetness, this is the natural level of sweetness left from the fermentation. So next, moving on to mainland Portugal and the Douro Valley, which is a beautiful UNESCO World Heritage Site, we have port, which everyone is familiar with. Now this is produced from many grape varieties, up to about 40, but the main ones are Touriga Nacional, Tinta Franca, Tinta Roriz and many others. Many producers actually don't really know what's in their vineyards, but it's the fortification and the aging that really gives it its character. The main soil types here are granitic schist, which is a very sort of stony soil, quite poor, but the vine really thrives in that environment. And it's hand harvested usually. And the main thing when it gets into the winery is the extraction. Now, what they want to do is to get the maximum amount of the colouring matter out, and all those pigments and all the tannins out of the grape skins. So they're traditionally they would use granite lajars, as they're called, which are these big, shallow troughs where all the vignerons, all the wine pickers would literally trample the grapes. In pictures you've probably seen, it's the traditional way of macerating all grapes, but here they do it to a much greater extent to extract the maximum amount of those colouring matters and the tannins from the skins. Because what happens next is the wine is fermented in the normal way, but it's halted by the addition of grape spirit, as we mentioned earlier. So that all of the sugar is not turned into alcohol, so the residual sugar leaves you with a sweet wine, but also fortified to about 20%. Now what happens next depends on what style you want to make. The two main styles are tawny port, where the wine is aged in barrel oxidatively. This controlled oxidation gradually turns the wine into an amber colour, a bit like the Madeira we just saw. Now, most tawnies are a blend of different ages. You can get 10-year-old, 20-year-old. It's not exactly that age. It's a blend of older or younger barrels to make a consistent house style. The other main style is ruby port. Now, that can be anything from a basic ruby port, a ruby reserve, a late bottle vintage, which is better in quality again, where it's a vintage wine, but it's bottled later, so it doesn't have quite so much of a deposit left in it, and it's very age-worthy. And the very top of the tree is vintage port, which is from an exceptionally good year, which is there's only about 3 every decade on average that are made, and they can last for decades. The 77, 63, they're all still very much in the middle of their lives. The other styles within there's also single quinta, where a lot of these small farm holdings, where they often go into the main vintage port of the house, like Wares, Dow's, Graham's in this case. It's not a vintage year, but it's still a very good year, so they do a bottling from that single estate, and that can be a very good sort of junior vintage port at a very reasonable price. And another style that sits somewhere in between is a crusted port, which is a wine from a particular year, but it's bottled later after about 6 to 8 years, so that it does form a deposit in the bottle and it is age-worthy, but it's again like a junior vintage port rather than a full vintage port, and they can be really good value, so let's give this a try. So here, even at 7 years old, the wine's really dark. Obviously still a lot of pigments and colour matter in there. You can barely see through it. Still a lot of colour on the rim. The colour on the rim often shows the development. If it's still quite purple, it's very young. If it's a brick red or even a sort of slightly amber colour, it indicates age. Here, it's somewhere in the middle. It's heading towards brick red, so it's showing some maturation, but not very much. On the nose, we've got bags of fruit, loads of mulberry, getting a little bit of the alcohol coming through as well. It's a little bit prickly. Really nice fruit character, a little bit of chocolate and cinnamon on the finish as well. And on the palate, lovely sweetness, lovely balance of fruit, acidity, gorgeous structure. It's got a little bit of quince coming through as well. Really nice wine. You can see why this is perfect with things like cheese, because it's just got that real punch to it. Yeah, absolutely perfect at the end of the meal. So I hope you enjoyed the wines. You've got something here to go before your starter, something with your pudding, and something to go with your cheese at the end. We hope you've enjoyed these sessions with us, and thank you for tuning in. We'll be doing more of these in the new year. This really was a whistle stop. I could quite happily talk for an hour just on this one wine. So we'll be doing more of this in the new year, and we look forward to seeing you then.